So tell us a little bit about your educational journey at Cambridge and your teaching. What kind of things you had to study to become credentialed in the classics and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure, of course. So classics is a kind of vague sounding word. It sounds like you just read classic novels, and it's that kind of, when you go into the bookshop and look for classics books, you often end up with a load of Jane Austens. But actually, what it tends to mean in England is it means Latin and ancient Greek. So it used to be the kind of, back in the day, it was the thing that was studied at school. So when my dad was at school, if you went to a kind of boarding school, you would study Latin and Greek. Everybody would study Latin and Greek. A few years earlier than him, it was really the only thing that anyone was interested in. So if you were super bright, you did Latin and Greek. If you were kind of considered not so bright, maybe a bit thick, you were allowed to do maths. And if you were really too bad for Latin and Greek or maths, then you did science. And so a lot of Britain's great scientists actually kind of were the bottom tier. If you talk to them, they're just still alive. They did science because they were considered sort of slightly too hopeless to do anything else. Anyway, so classics used to be super important. And then Britain realized that actually speaking Latin and ancient Greek isn't that useful. In the Second World War, particularly, I think they thought, why does everyone else have lots of nuclear physicists and we've got lots of people who could speak to Julius Caesar? And then they recast the syllabus after the Second World War to do a bit less Latin, a bit less ancient Greek, and a bit more something that might actually be useful in the modern world. So
now, what do you want to have to say about that and your journey to coming to the understanding of that?
Yeah, well, so these are very appealing. So I start the book with one of my favorite other Jesuses. So these are just other tellings that certain kinds of Christianity believed in. And there's a Jesus who killed people, who was really popular. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense because gods in the ancient world killed people all the time. Because really, if you've ever seen a small boy damming water in a stream, then you'll be able to guess what happens next when another boy goes up and breaks it. And I'm sure if you've seen this, boys get pretty cross about this kind of thing, but not all boys are omnipotent deities. So he turns around to the boy and he curses him and he says, "You will wither like a tree and bear neither root nor fruit." And the boy sort of withers up. We don't really know what that involves. There was another one who sold someone into slavery. There was another one who had someone crucified in his own stead, according to one account, and then sat opposite laughing while the other man died in agony. And again, this is surprising to us because we think of the one and only Jesus who is in the text that survived the Gospels, Jesus that we know, the long-haired, bearded, Sunday school and sunbeams kind of Jesus. And that's the one we know, but there were many iterations that came. The ones I've just mentioned, they were after probably the one that we know, but that clearly the ones that we know are the oldest ones that we have in existence. But between the actual life of Jesus and the stories that we have, there was clearly something happened because, unless you believe that that's true, something has happened to the narrative in those years between when Jesus died and when they got written down.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit more about some of the other sort of miracle workers. Now, I'm going to butcher this name because I've only read it. Asclepius, probably not saying that right. And also Apollonius of Tyana. Now, I'd read about him in some of Bart Ehrman's work, so I was mildly familiar. He actually does an exercise in his intro classes where he describes Apollonius, and then he asks the class to say, "Who am I describing?" And every hand goes up, and every hand says Jesus, and he goes, "Nope, sorry, not exactly."
So he was the Greek god of medicine, and if you go to ancient temples, you'll see lots of offering. If you've been on holiday to ancient Greece, you might go to a temple and you might see like little model eyes and legs and arms, because Asclepius was the god of medicine, and if you had a problem with your eye or your arm or your leg, you would take a model and you leave it as a kind of, they call them votive offerings. And one of the things I think that we forget when we look at the ancient world and when we look at the Gospels is how much of this is medicine. A lot of ancient religion was really not much more than healthcare with a halo. Because, you're having arguments about healthcare now in America, but imagine if you had none. Imagine if none of it worked. You don't have to be very sick for very long before you start wanting some kind of divine help if you've got no other help on earth.